Everyone ignored the alien cry for help, until a human captain heard it. Black Star Outpost wasn't built for beauty. It was a slab of titanium welded into the skin of the void. All edges, cables, and flickering lights. The air smelled like coolant and burnt synthetic. The only window was a heat-treated slit of transparent aluminum that looked out onto nothing. Just black. Inside the comms bay, Darius Holt sat slouched in a chair that groaned every time he shifted. One boot on the console, the other tapping rhythmically on the floor. Around him, machines hummed, the tired breath of a station that rarely slept, never dreamed. He yawned. Again, same signal traffic, static, corporate spam, junk from low-orbit junkers, and that ghost from Jupiter's rings. Then came the pulse. 3 soft beeps. Uneven, lopsided, off rhythm. He frowned. The screen flickered just once. Then again, a whisper slithered into the comm stream like oil on water. Vel. Sumar? Kalen. Not English, not anything the lexicon could pin down. The words looped again, slower this time, less like speech, more like surrender. Holt leaned forward. Something in the voice, not fear, not pain, but weariness, the kind that sat deep, coiled like a dying sun. His fingers flew across the keys. Record, analyze, isolate. The station lights buzzed, and for half a second, Holt thought the walls had leaned closer. He reached for the override comms, patched to central, then stopped. What if it's another trap? What if it's like SATA 3, the fake distress call that cost 146 lives? He swallowed hard. His hand moved anyway. Some things weren't choices, just instinct. Got something, Holt? The voice cut the air clean in half. Captain Nolan Thane stepped into the room like gravity followed him. Sharp lines, gray uniform, a half-healed scar above his left brow that never faded right. His boots didn't make a sound, and that was somehow worse. Holt straightened. Sir, I'm getting something. Not human, possibly not meant for us at all. Nolan's eyes didn't blink. He stared at the waveform dancing across the screen, the 3 pulses repeating like a tired heartbeat. Vel, Sumar, Kalen. The captain's brow creased, not in confusion, in memory. He'd heard this cadence before. Not the words, but the rhythm. A transmission from 12 years back, deep edge of Lara sector. They'd responded, too late. All that was left were burnt hulls and airlock doors swinging open into vacuum. Nolan exhaled slow. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the void, it remembered. Holt turned. Should I flag Central Command, sir? Nolan didn't answer at first. He watched the signal repeat a 4th time, then 5th. No, he said finally, we'll hold. Sir? Nolan's jaw tensed. I want a deep scan. If it repeats again, double verify origin and get me long-range relays prepped. No alerts. Holt blinked. You think it's real? Nolan glanced at him. Just once. I think someone out there isn't screaming. That's usually when it's real. As Holt scrambled to obey, the lights in the corridor dimmed briefly. A power flux. Black Star hadn't glitched in weeks. On screen, the signal looped again. Slower. Like whoever sent it was fading. Outside the window, something passed. A shape in the dark. Too slow for debris, too graceful for a ship. Gone before Holt could blink. The captain stood still for a long time, then quiet to himself. Let's see if the dead really stay silent. In the storage bay below, 2 patrol ships sat idle, Solace and Artemis. They hadn't flown in weeks. Artemis had a dented wing still unpainted, a relic from an old skirmish that Nolan refused to fix. He once said, leave the scar. It reminds us that surviving isn't clean. He turned and walked out. Orders would follow. But the moment had already passed. Holt sat in silence. The signal still played, and for the first time, it didn't sound alien. It sounded like someone had stopped asking for help and simply wanted someone to listen. And humanity had heard. He whispered almost without knowing, someone's coming, hold on. Behind him, the outpost pulsed with quiet life, a whisper in the void, and this time it would not be ignored. The voice came back. It wasn't a voice built for human ears. It rasped like thunder underwater, a ripple dragged through static. But it carried something unmistakable. Not terror, not demand, just exhaustion and dignity. Sumar, last bastion, Voralis 5, no answer, we will not ask again. Holt stared at the console like it had just insulted his mother. That wasn't background noise, sir. That was a person, or something very close. Captain Nolan didn't move. His jaw twitched. Eyes still locked on the pattern scrolling across the screen. A beat, then another. Origin? Holt's fingers danced. Somewhere past sector edge. Coordinates cluster 9G, matches planetary drift, Viralis system. But it's been flagged non-viable for colonization, radiation bloom, interference field. Then what the hell are they doing out there? They're dying, sir. Silence again, the kind that builds pressure behind your teeth. Morthard gather. 3 levels below, the hangar bay vibrated as Artemis's reactor spun up. It wasn't ordered, not officially, but someone had flipped the startup switch. Crew started gathering, mechanics first, then engineers, then a few Marines with nothing better to do. The kind of people who heard whispers before orders. When Nolan finally walked into the bay, the room snapped to attention without being told. Even the ship looked ready. Artemis was an ugly, silver-blasted, stubby-nosed rescue frigate. She looked like someone had taken a cargo crate, welded engines to it, and dared God to stop her. There was something comforting about her scars. "Why are you fueling the bird?" Nolan asked. Chief Kor scratched his beard with a hydrospanner. "Didn't know we weren't, sir." "And the loading?" "Fuel's already in. You want me to take it out?" Kor's smirk was all teeth. He'd been in this game long enough to see the gears behind Nolan's eyes. From the upper deck, Holt leaned over the railing. "Sir, I've parsed the language fragments from the transmission. Most of it's degraded, but the name repeated is Alray. Maybe a title, maybe the speaker, and the word Bastion keeps coming up. Military or a refugee pocket? Maybe both." Nolan looked around. Crew were already moving. Unofficially, no orders yet. He hated this part. The half step before command, before he made it real. The last time he jumped early, they'd found a ghost town. A planet emptied down to its bones, and all that was left was a whisper loop still transmitting, the dead asking for help long after they were dust. He'd sworn not to act on emotion again. But this didn't feel like emotion. It felt like responsibility. Back on the bridge, Commander Vallis appeared on comms. Stern, precise, and 3 weeks away from retirement, the worst combination for a conversation like this. "You're not seriously considering response, are you, Nolan? It's a signal, Callan, a live one. It's off protocol. So was our species once." Vallis sighed like someone being asked to love their ex-wife's cat. "We're not authorized for extra-system interventions without council clearance. You know this. I didn't ask for authorization, I asked for silence." "Nolan, if this gets ugly, I want them blaming me, not the board, not the crew, me." Vallis blinked. That long, slow blink only bureaucrats and snakes perfected. "Are you logging this?" "No." "Good, because I just lost signal. Must be sunspot interference." Then he was gone. By the time Nolan returned to the hangar, the crew were armed, loaded, and pretending not to care. Holt handed him a datapad. I cross-referenced their signal pattern with old Alliance records. That language, Vorar dialect, early colony reports had it. "They're real, sir. Real and old." Nolan stared at the pad. "They don't sound like they're asking anymore." "No, sir," Holt said, quieter now. "They sound like they've stopped hoping." That hit harder than expected. He turned to Artemis and gave the only order he needed. "Launch window in 8. Anyone not on board by then, stay here, and pray we come back angry." Holt grinned. "Permission to make it dramatic, sir?" "Denied. But you'll do it anyway." "Yes, sir." They walked side by side toward the ramp. The crew followed, quiet, focused. No one said hero, no one said mission, because they all felt it. This wasn't rescue, this was redemption. In the launch bay's flickering light, someone had sprayed a single word across Artemis's hull. "Answer." Nolan paused, ran a hand across the letters. Symbolic? Maybe. Or maybe just a reminder. Sometimes the only thing that separates silence from salvation is someone picking up the damn phone. Artemis roared like something alive. Her belly lit up in strips of amber and blue, flickering as reactors hummed from idle to combat readiness. The floor beneath the crew shivered, not from fear, but from the vibration of will being converted into propulsion. Inside, everything smelled of metal, sweat, and faith. Holt adjusted his harness and looked across the cockpit at Captain Nolan, who hadn't said a word since liftoff was cleared. "You ever get the feeling," Holt said, "buckling in, That silence is louder right before we make a stupid decision. Nolan didn't answer, which was answer enough. The launch clamps hissed. Artemis disengaged from Black Star's docking strut with a deep groan, like a beast stretching its spine after a long sleep. Outside the viewport, space uncoiled, stars blinking through radiation haze, a drifting piece of solar panel twisting slowly like a dead leaf in black water. The stars were the same, but the silence wasn't. In the rear hangar, 2 Marines were checking over a crate of plasma repeaters. One of them had carved a tiny skull into the handle of his rifle. The other wore a sticker on his armor that read, "Hugs are free, charges may apply." Neither was talking about heroism, but both had tightened their armor straps twice. Above them, mounted like a relic, the flag of the first Earthfleet expedition still hung, tattered, faded, but untouched. We go because others can't. The old motto, burned into steel, stitched into muscle memory. Holt tapped at the console. Entering zone edge. Radiation starting to spike. No EM response yet. Hull shielding holding. Nolan kept staring out the window. "You don't trust it." "I don't trust things that stay quiet too long," Nolan murmured, "or too suddenly ask for help." Holt smirked. "That's fair. I also don't trust cheese that doesn't melt." That earned him a slight glance. Progress. Flat. Flash. Light. A ripple across the void. "Did you see that?" Holt asked. "Static lensing," Nolan replied. "Void's bending." He didn't mention the part where he'd seen this before, during the fall of Eno Station when the enemy hadn't arrived with sound or light or ships. Just silence. Then wreckage. He could still remember the look on Lieutenant Paris's face, right before the hull gave in, one hand on the emergency seal, the other on Nolan's shoulder. "Tell them we didn't run." Nolan never got to tell anyone. No survivors. No data recovered. Just a field of bodies and drifting echoes. Back in the cockpit, Artemis crossed into the interference zone. The lights dimmed for a heartbeat, engines thrummed unevenly. "Hold it steady," Nolan ordered. "We're through. Partial data coming in," Holt reported. "Wait, we've got motion. Not ours." He brought up the feed. Blurry shapes, fragments of structure, a distortion field like fog made of math. Then, a voice. Soft, low, female, measured. "This is Commander Alre Viralian, last known shield-bearer of Viralis Bastion. To any who hear this, we do not ask for rescue. We do not expect mercy, but if you are listening, know that we stood." The voice didn't crack, didn't beg. It simply landed like a blade set gently on stone. Nolan leaned back in his chair. That voice. Not desperate, defiant. "Is she broadcasting live?" he asked. Holt checked. "Negative. That's a loop. But there's a time marker. This message was sent 2 hours ago. So someone's still breathing." The crew stiffened slightly. This wasn't ghosts. This was now. In the rear cabin, Core passed out ration bars and caffeine tubes like a bartender at the world's last pub. A junior pilot asked, "Sir, do we have a plan?" Core grunted. "Plan's simple, kid." He pointed to a sticker on Artemis's wall, an old, oil-stained piece of sarcasm that had outlived 5 captains. "If you can't outgun it, outfly it. If that fails, insult its mother." Back in the cockpit, Holt looked up. "Captain, you ever wonder what happens if we don't come back?" Nolan took a long breath. "We become a story." Then softer. "And if we do come back?" He paused. Then said it anyway. "Maybe the galaxy starts listening." They passed the last radiation marker. Ahead, nothing but warped shadows, faint motion, and silence clawing at the hull. The kind of silence that wasn't absence, the kind that watched. Holt flicked the cockpit light off. Just starlight and reflections now. No words. Nolan reached forward and placed one gloved hand against the cold glass. No prayer, no speech, just a symbol. And Artemis flew into the dark. The void didn't welcome them. It absorbed Artemis like a whisper swallowed mid-sentence. No explosions, no alarms, just stillness so total it felt artificial. Outside the viewport, the stars dimmed, the kind of dark that swallowed light and didn't give it back. "Approaching coordinates," Holt reported. But what? "There's nothing here, sir. No structures, no ships, no orbital debris." Nolan frowned. "Scan again." Holt did. Once, twice, then for good measure, hit the panel with the heel of his palm. Still nothing. Signal's still active, Holt said. He pulled it up again, the same whisper, looping through static like a ghost begging to be forgotten. Last bastion, we will not ask again. Voralis stands. Directionality? Hard to pin down. Interference keeps shifting vectors. Like the signal's bouncing off something that shouldn't be there. Or someone doesn't want to be found. Nolan stood from his chair, walked up to the glass, and stared into what should have been a battlefield. There was nothing, not even wreckage, just patterns in the dark, repeating, watching. Back in the comms bay, a junior tech, Dre, looked up from her console. Sir, this doesn't make sense. We're receiving mass distortion echoes, but there's no mass to distort, like a shadow with no object. Ghosts don't have shadows, Holt muttered. Maybe they do out here, she replied, voice low. Slow. In the crew deck, silence settled thick. Kor played with a dented coin he always carried. It had belonged to his brother, lost in a mission not unlike this one. The coin was bent at the edge, a flaw no engineer ever fixed. Just like him, he didn't speak, just held it up toward the hull as if waiting to hear it resonate. Nothing did. But Artemis shivered. In the cockpit, Holt turned toward Nolan. Sir, we should at least ping a response. Let whoever's transmitting know they've been heard. Nolan didn't move. He was staring at something. Not outside, inside. Memory. You ever been so afraid, he said slowly, that you told yourself it was someone else's problem? Holt paused. Sir? First command, triage station in the Zandari belt. Civilian evac. Got a transmission? Garbled. Low power. Could have been distress. Could have been solar flare. I hesitated, waited for confirmation. Protocol. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. By the time we got there, he said, we didn't need rescue. We needed coffins. Nolan stepped back toward the console. Route main comms through my authorization code. Engage full bandwidth. Encrypt if needed. Prepare to transmit. Holt's eyes widened. We're breaking radio silence? We're answering. But sir, if someone's jamming, then let them hear us. He looked at Holt. Voice steady. If this is bait, we bite smart. If it's not, we bite first. The crew gathered in silence. No speeches, no rallying cry. But every eye turned to the forward panel as Nolan leaned into the comms mic. He didn't shout. He didn't soften. He just spoke like he was telling the truth. To whoever is listening, this is Captain Nolan Thane of the Artemis, human vessel, Alliance registered. We have received your signal. You are not alone. Help is not a question. It's coming. If this is a trap, good, because we brought teeth. He clicked the mic off. No one moved. Even Holt forgot to breathe. Then the ship's AI chimed softly. Message delivered. Echo detected. Someone heard you. From somewhere deep in the interference, a second signal came through. Faint, cracked, almost reluctant, but different. New, not a loop. A live voice, broken but present. Human, you shouldn't be here. Leave before it wakes again. Nolan's eyes narrowed. That's not a warning, he said. That's guilt. The radar pulsed once. Something flickered at the edge of visual range, like a ripple behind a curtain. A shape large enough to block starlight, but leaving no signature. Captain? Holt pointed. Did the dark just move? Another pulse, then silence, then a single burst of static, short, loud, intentional. The screen flashed briefly. One word burned into the data stream. Why? The crew stared. Then slowly, every eye turned to Nolan. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate. He walked back to the console, opened the mic again, and this time said only 4 words. Because the humans heard. In that moment, in that silence, Artemis became more than a ship. It became a promise. And the dark finally answered. The reply wasn't a voice. It was a shape. Faint. Hidden beneath camouflage so complex even Artemis's scanners blinked in confusion. A ship, or what remained of one, drifted into visual range. Burned. Cracked. Held together by cables, willpower, and what looked like molten armor fused by emergency repairs. Its hull glowed faint green under interference light. The symbol on its flank was a triangle folded into a spiral, the ancient crest of the Vorar Imperium. No one had seen it in a century. Then came the voice. Captain Nolan Thane, human ship Artemis, female, dry, precise. with an accent that bent vowels in directions Earth tongues never dared. "I am Commander Alray of Viralis Bastion. If you came for conquest, leave now. If you came for aid, you are too late." Nolan stepped forward, hands behind his back. "No conquest, Commander, and we don't usually do aid either, but we heard you. Too many here, too few listen. A beat. Why now? What do you gain?" Holt muttered from his station. "Charming welcome." "Quiet," Nolan said. "You're not broadcasting a distress call." "Because I refuse to die begging." That landed heavy. Even the Marines in the back of the bridge stopped shifting. "Commander," Nolan said, "we scanned your zone. What we saw or didn't see wasn't natural. What are we facing?" Alray hesitated. Static cracked through the channel. "Then, they are called nothing. Because naming gives form. We refused to name them, but they took form anyway. We called them silence. We believed silence meant peace, but silence only hid their hunger." She sent a fragment, garbled visuals stitched from damaged telemetry. The footage shook, dark shapes sliding across hulls, no heat, no signal. Just pressure and disintegration. Ships vanished like ink spilled in water. One Vorar fighter spun in panic, fired every weapon. Nothing hit, nothing screamed, it just wasn't there anymore. Alray's voice returned. "We could not fight what refused to exist. We are scientists, architects, we built cities from orbit. We were not ready for enemies who required neither body nor hatred." Nolan exhaled, his voice calm. "We are." Silence. "Then, you think because you bring fire, you can scare shadows?" "No," Nolan said. "I think because we've lived in the dark longer, we've learned how to light it up." That finally drew a pause, then a chuckle. "Human arrogance. We heard about it, even out here. Reputation's hard to maintain when most who meet us explode." Alray paused longer this time. "If we provide coordinates, entry vectors, the Bastion's last holdout may still stand, but only if the route remains invisible." "We're good at hiding our weaknesses," Nolan said. "Sometimes by acting like we have none." A bluff. A flag. On cue, Artemis's rear bay opened. Drones flew silently into the dark, their chassis blinking cold blue, scattering sensor decoys into void like breadcrumbs. At the same time, Holt rerouted Artemis's engine heat through cooling vents, making their signature look like a dead satellite. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Nolan's voice dropped lower, firmer. "Here's the plan. We move in silent. Drones bait the silence. You hold position. If they bite, we burn. We're small enough to be underestimated, exactly once. And if they don't bite, then they learn humans don't come to knock. We break the door." Alray's response didn't come immediately. Then, "There are children aboard." That changed everything. The crew flinched. Holt swore under his breath. "I thought this was a military outpost," Nolan said. "It was. Then we stopped pretending victory would arrive. We brought the survivors inside, gave them stories instead of shields." Nolan closed his eyes for half a second, then opened the channel. "We're not leaving them. You may die. We're good at that too." For a long breath, the channel stayed open but silent. Then the Vorar commander said one last thing. "Captain Thane, if your kind falls here, history won't remember." Nolan stared out the glass. Artemis drifted like a ghost made of steel and fire, silent against the weight of the void. He spoke quietly. "Then, we remember each other." In the armory, a soldier painted something on his shoulder plate, the Earth symbol for light, an old Terran rune shaped like a torch. Others copied it. No one explained it. They didn't need to, because they were coming. And now, they had a name. The first silent appeared like a bruise across the stars. Not a ship, not a creature, just a ripple, a void within the void, bending light in patterns that made the eye ache and sensors scream. "Visual contact," Holt shouted. "Target is, I don't know what I'm looking at, sir." "That makes two of us," Nolan muttered. "Prep the strike pattern. Artemis goes first. Solace follows at 20. The ship's split formation. Artemis turns sideways, showing its thinner silhouette. Less mass, harder to lock. Drones scattered outward, flashing decoy signals. "Let's look weak," Nolan said. "Make them greedy." From the flanks, 2 more distortions appeared. Long, slow, cold, like a leviathan stretching inside glass. No heat, no EM, just pure absence. Then, impact. One of the drones vanished, not exploded, not shredded, just gone, like the universe forgot it had ever existed. Confirmed contact, Holt whispered. They're reacting. Nolan's voice stayed calm. Good. Time to make them regret it. In the rear bay, Sergeant Dax kicked open the hatch. 2 tactical teams spilled out into vacuum, magnetic boots clinking, rifles charged. Their visors lit up with static. Silence didn't just mess with tech, they injected doubt. Even sensors began to glitch emotionally, showing readings that contradicted each other. Eyes on movement, Dax called. 2 o'clock. Close. Fast. He pivoted and froze. A shadow moved past the stars too fast to trace, then behind him, then a whisper in his helmet. You are late. He spun, fired. Nothing. But Solace had arrived. The second human vessel wasn't large, just sleek, fast, and covered in jamming panels. Solace shot across the Silence position at top speed, emitting a burst of signal pulses tuned to confuse predator instincts. The Silence flinched. It wasn't fear, just surprise. And that was enough. Artemis opened fire. They didn't use big guns. They used calculated noise. Sonic distortions, heat flares, projected feedback loops, anything that resembled life. Humans weren't here to win. They were here to get noticed. Hit confirmed, Holt shouted. 1 target recoiling, another circling wide. They don't like confusion. Who does? Nolan said. Keep it messy. Inside the Vorar holdout, Alri watched from her cracked bridge. The screen showed flickers, chaotic light, human ships dancing between shadow and flame. Her second-in-command leaned over. They fight like they expect to die. No, Alri whispered. They fight like they've died before and got bored. Outside, Artemis spun on axis. A mine pod ejected from its belly. Small, blinking, warm with pulse data. The nearest Silent drifted closer, pulled by the heat signature. Then, flash, EMP bloom. Not enough to destroy, just enough to wake them up. Solace darted through the gap, launching shrapnel pulses along a mathematically impossible curve. Holt blinked. How did that hit? Nolan grinned. It didn't, but it made them think it did. Then Artemis took a glancing blow. Not a hit, a memory removal. The hull shimmered. For a heartbeat, the left side of the ship wasn't just damaged, it was absent, flickering as if the ship forgot it was supposed to exist there. Sirens flared, lights turned red. Dax's voice barked over comms. We've got conceptual breach. Repeat, they're erasing material memory, lock armor templates. Steel panels snapped into place, projecting neural echoes of Artemis's original shape. Crude, but it worked. For now. They don't break you, Holt said. They doubt you. Then it's a good thing, Nolan said. We're stubborn bastards. He tapped the mic. Commander Alray, corridor breach clear. But they're adapting. We need to hit hard before they reset. Agreed. We have 1 shot. Bastion corridor Alpha 9 is exposed. You can cut through to the shelter if you breach now. Done. Nolan turned to his crew. All teams, draw fire. Make it loud. A beat. Then added, and make it human. Artemis surged forward. The twin ships roared, not with guns, but with presence. Engines howling, flares launching, lights strobing like a manic heartbeat. Even the void blinked. Dax's team charged the breach. Boots clanging, rifles humming. One Marine slapped a sticker on his shoulder. I exist, therefore I am a problem. No one laughed, but everyone smiled. Inside the Vorar corridors, the air shimmered. Silence crawled across the walls like absence with claws. Then, human flashbangs, paint bombs, screams in 30 languages, and a speaker blaring opera. One Silent lunged, and Holt dropped it with a kinetic spike right through the eye that wasn't there. First kill, he said, panting. Maybe. Back on Artemis, Nolan's screen flickered again. Another signal. Different voice. They are surprised. They are afraid. He looked at Holt. You recording this? Sir, I'm archiving this. Outside, Solace made one final pass. It left behind a contrail of ionized gas, shaped like a question mark. By accident? Maybe. But the message was clear. We're still asking questions. And the void, it just blinked. The line broke, twice, and both times, the humans rebuilt it not with shields, but with defiance. Artemis's front armor was gone. The hull peeled open like a wound, metal curling in space. Sparks spilled like fireflies drowning in vacuum. Inside, Sergeant Dax held the corridor with 2 Marines, both bleeding, one conscious. Outside, the silence circled again. "Armor integrity at 28%, Holt called out. His voice was steady, but his left sleeve was soaked. A sharp bit of shrapnel had kissed his arm earlier. He hadn't told anyone. There wasn't time. Solace flared its engines across the line, disrupting the silence approach. Not to strike, but to distract. A dancer with death. Inside the Vorar holdout, Commander Alri watched the footage through cracked monitors. Her second said nothing. He simply handed her a breath filter. The air was turning acidic from systems overdrive. "They still stand," he said, "because they haven't learned how to fall," she replied. Holt stumbled into the side panel and grabbed the rail. Nolan saw the blood. "You're hit." "Not enough to make me interesting," Holt replied. "Keep pushing data." "Sit down, patch it." "No offense, sir, but if I'm going to bleed, I'd rather do it usefully." Nolan looked at him, paused, then nodded once. Dax's voice came through. "We're holding Corridor Delta 3. Barely. We've got Vorar here now. Silent types, but good fighters." He paused. "They don't talk much, just move." Vorar warriors stood beside the humans. Tall, thin-armored, faces obscured by breathing helms that pulsed with dull green light. One of them, back-scorched, shoved a fallen beam aside to pull a human soldier from rubble. He said nothing, just returned to firing. A Vorar child, maybe 6, maybe 60, huddled in a side alcove near the shelter doors. A human medic passed, then doubled back, dropping his last power cell into the child's hands without a word. The child blinked, then wordlessly handed it to the next injured. Aura saw that on the feed. Her voice cracked for the first time, just one word: Rylash. In Artemis, pressure alarms screamed. Hull breach. Section 7. Core. Nolan barked. "Get the override sealed." The engineer's voice snapped back. "I'm using chewing gum and spite down here, sir." Sparks burst from the main wall. Holt dropped to avoid a short. His hand caught the rail again. He hissed. The cut opened wider. Nolan moved toward him, but Holt raised one shaky finger. "Don't. I've got this." "Why?" "Because someone needs to remember why we came." In the shadows, a silent moved. No footfall, no warning. It slipped past 2 Marines and reached the inner ring. Then, clang. A wrench, thrown by a Vorar child. It missed, but the creature turned. That moment cost it. 3 Marines opened fire. 1 Vorar leapt in from above, blade first. The silent folded in on itself like a question collapsing. Nolan stood on the bridge. Smoke in the air, lights flickering red. The ship groaned under pressure. His crew looked to him. He said only one thing: "It's supposed to hurt." The phrase passed through the ship. Someone whispered it in engineering. A medic muttered it over a wound. Dax spray-painted it on a collapsed bulkhead. They weren't just holding. They were hurting forward. Back on the Vorar side, Alri looked across at her people. Some bleeding, some coughing, all silent. Then one stepped forward. An elder. No weapon. He knelt beside a dying human soldier, pressed 2 fingers to the man's brow, and for the first time, spoke English. "You stayed." The human, gasping, smiled through blood. "Couldn't leave the party early." Alri turned back to her console. The line wasn't just holding. It was becoming something else. A bond made of fire and will. She opened a private channel. "Captain Nolan, we have an opening. Corridor Omega 3. If you can make it, you reach the central seal. What's behind it? Hope, or a very poetic end." Nolan looked at Holt, who smiled through pale lips. "Poetic's fine, beats dying ironically." Nolan keyed the mic. "All units, push forward. We've got a door to knock on." And behind him, the message scrawled across the main console in someone's bloodied glove: "We stayed." Space cracked, not with noise, but presence. The void behind Artemis pulsed once, then tore open. From nothing, 3 massive human vessels erupted into the battlefield like burning gods. The Bastion, Vanguard, and St. Elmo's Wake. All engines flared crimson. Their hulls bore fresh scars, and each one lit up with the wrath of 1,000 suns. New contacts, Holt choked, still gripping the console. Friendlies. Very angry friendlies. The lead ship's comms burst through. "This is Commander Callahan of the Bastion. Captain Nolan, you look like hell." Nolan exhaled. For the first time, maybe even smiled. "Good to see you too, Callahan. Mind making some noise? Wouldn't miss it. Bastion to fleet. Open the gates." The sky burned. Railguns fired in rhythm. Missiles howled across darkness like wolves freed from the leash. The silence didn't understand anger, but they understood pressure. And this was pressure with purpose. On the ground, Dax looked up as the heavens lit amber and violet. Now that's a proper entrance. A Vorar beside him stared in silence, then, slowly for the first time, smiled. In the Vorar control room, Alri staggered toward the window. Outside, human ships shielded her own with fire and metal. Her people, those who had once whispered stories of Earth dwellers as wild, savage, selfish, watched with something dangerously close to awe. Her second in command muttered, "They came back." "They always do," Alri whispered. Inside Bastion's command, Callahan leaned forward. "Push Corridor Omega-3. Clear the way for Nolan. Artemis stays point. Everyone else, shield the refugees." Holt's console flickered again. "Incoming private from Bastion. Varga on the line." Nolan sighed. "Of course it's Varga." The screen blinked to life. "Nolan, you suicidal bastard. Again? Nice beard. Nice hole in your hull." Nolan's voice dropped lower, steadier. "I've got a corridor to breach, and about 50 civilians between it and a very poetic explosion. Say no more. We'll keep the monsters distracted." Pause. "Go make history." Down on the Vorar decks, doors hissed open. Human engineers poured out, covered in soot, helmets scorched, dragging welding torches, drone kits, and hope in duffel bags. "Let's fix a planet," one of them said. One crew ran toward a fractured corridor, part of the outer shell where heat was venting into space. Inside, a Vorar technician collapsed beside a cooling vent. A human soldier reached her, handed over his oxygen line. She blinked, confused. "You don't even know me." "Don't need to. You're breathing. That's enough." Inside Artemis, Holt wiped blood from his brow. Callahan brought a med team. "They're requesting triage orders." "Tell them we're alive," Nolan said, "but ugly." Holt grinned. "You are ugly already, sir." Solace dropped flares across the battlefield, each one broadcasting a coded message in Old Earth Terran Morse. One Vorar read the translation aloud, "We're not leaving." He paused, then added, almost reverently, "They wrote that in light." Above, Bastion's railguns overheated, but they didn't stop firing. Callahan barked orders with one hand and drank coffee with the other. The young ensign beside him gawked. You're not afraid?" "Son, I flew through a star once by accident. This is therapy." Inside the Vorar ship, children stared at the view screens. They didn't cheer, they didn't speak. They simply watched as the ships of a species once feared chose to bleed. For them. Ulrich stood at the observation deck, one hand pressed against the reinforced glass. Then whispered something in her language. "A prayer? A promise?" Nolan's voice answered over comms. "We're at the corridor. Opening now." "What do you see?" she asked. A pause. Then, a chance. It was breaking apart, not slowly, but like a dam in reverse. The Vorar transport, Varal 1, tilted along its fractured spine, leaking air and souls into the stars. "Structural failure in 6 minutes," Holt barked. "She's going." The camera feed flickered. Children inside, huddled behind emergency bulkheads, some clutching others, one clutching a small green ball. A boy, Vorar, barely standing, stared into the viewport with wide eyes. His breath fogged the glass. He didn't blink. Nolan's voice cut through the tension. "Any crew left on board?" Ulrich's voice came in, shaken. "Only non-combatants, 24. We used it as a backup shelter." "Then we hold." Outside, 3 silents drifted toward the Varal like vultures circling a flame. Callahan's fleet kept 2 occupied. But the third? It knew. It moved through the battle like a whole with intent. In Artemis's hangar, a small team assembled, engineers, not soldiers. They carried welders, patch plates, oxygen tanks. "Let me get this straight," Core said, strapping in. "We're gonna spacewalk onto a rupturing alien ship surrounded by invisible monsters?" Holt grinned, blood-stained bandage on his arm. "You say that like it's not a Tuesday." Dax stood at the edge of the airlock, rifle slung behind his back, helping one engineer secure the last tether. "Why us?" the tech asked. Dax smirked, "Because we don't know how to give up." The doors opened, the vacuum roared, and 6 humans launched across space, jets on, hearts steady, hope fragile. The image burned across Artemis's bridge like myth in real time. Nolan whispered to himself, "Angels don't fly up, they fall down." On Varel 1, the child still watched. The green ball trembled in his hands, then the lights flickered, and the hull groaned like it remembered how to die. The humans landed. Boots hit metal, tools sparked to life. 2 began sealing the crack near the reactor core. Another rerouted a dying circuit with chewing gum and wire. A plasma weld failed. Sparks hit a tech's faceplate. Visor blackened. He kept going. Above them, the Silent approached. It blinked in and out, reality flickering like a broken thought. "Keep working," Dax ordered. "It only eats fear if we taste like it." Then he looked at the camera and smiled. "Record this." Artemis projected a decoy field. Bastion launched flares. Solace dived again, almost too close, but the Silent kept drifting, toward the viral, toward the child. Inside, the little Vorar pressed the green ball against the glass. It lit up faintly, reacting to stress, to memory, to hope. That tiny glow shimmered, and outside, the welders saw it. One tapped Dax. "She's watching," he nodded. "Then let's show her what humans do." It lit up faintly. The reactor sealed, the patch held, and just as the hull repressurized, boom, the Silent reached them. Dax turned, rifle raised, and a blast from Bastion's orbital cannon struck first. The Silent folded inward, like space taking a breath. Silence. Then static. Then Holt's voice. "Varel is intact, hull sealed, reactor stable." He paused and smiled. "She's alive." Inside the Vorar bridge, Alri watched the footage. Her lips trembled. She didn't speak. She didn't thank. She simply placed one hand on the console, closed her eyes, and let a single tear fall onto the glass. Nolan opened a channel. "Commander, we held the line. We reached the children." "I know." Her voice was calm. "I saw you bleed." Later, as the transport limped toward Bastion under escort, the child placed the green ball on a table. The human medic approached. "It's a memory core," the Vorar boy whispered. "It records moments that matter." He pushed it toward the soldier. "For you." The soldier blinked. "Me? Why?" "Because you made my world stop shaking." On the bridge of Artemis, the crew exhaled. They weren't clean, they weren't whole, but they were together. And the light outside was no longer a battlefield. It was a path. The air smelled like copper and rain. As Nolan stepped onto the Vorar ship, Threna's core, the pressure shifted. He felt it behind his teeth, a hum, as if the walls were breathing. The corridor was lit in muted blue, diffused through thick gas layers, a bioluminescent haze filtering every shadow. Each step echoed wetly. Nothing here was made by human hands, and yet it welcomed him. He passed by Vorar crew, armored, others wrapped in pressure robes. None bowed, none saluted, but all paused and watched, like they were trying to understand what exactly they were seeing. A human, alive, still standing. At the bridge, Aura waited. She was alone. Her breathing mask pulsed slowly, long silver tubes snaking from her shoulders into the ceiling. Her eyes in the strange lighting looked like burning emeralds. Nolan removed his helmet, tucked it under one arm, and nodded. "You asked us earlier," he said, voice rough from smoke and void, "why humans came." Aura didn't answer at first. She watched him, as if measuring time through silence. "Then you crossed the divide. You broke every order, risked annihilation, for a message not meant for you. Why?" Nolan looked out through the bridge's curved glass. Bastion floated nearby, its hull gleaming with burn scars. Below them, the half-ruined world of Veralis slowly rotated, dark storms crawling across it like bruises. He breathed, because no one else answered. But why care? You did not know us. Our war is not yours. Neither is suffering, he said, but it still matters. Alri stepped forward slowly. Her movements were more fluid than human, graceful, measured, like each step was chosen for its meaning. I was raised to believe humans were unpredictable, hungry, primitive. You are those things. A pause, then softer, but also something else. Nolan grinned faintly. Still savage? Yes, but not alone in your savagery. She placed one hand on the glass. Her fingers left small patterns of condensation. You bled for strangers. You could have left. So what now? He didn't answer right away. He walked forward, stood beside her, looked out with her, and then placed his hand next to hers just inches apart on the glass. You rebuild. We listen. And if you ever send another signal. He turned to her, eyes locked. We answer. Again. The bridge dimmed slightly. From the far wall, a panel opened. A floating crystal emerged, translucent, humming. A gift. A memory core. It holds a name, Alri said. Of a child who survived. She asked me to give it to the one who stopped the dark. Nolan took it gently, cradled it with bare hands. What's her name? Does it matter? He smiled. No. The silence returned. Not cold, not empty, but peaceful. As Nolan turned to leave, Alri spoke once more. You said your kind listens. Then listen now. If humans ever need us. She stepped back, voice steady. We will come. Later, as Artemis prepared for departure, Nolan stood at the airlock ramp, helmet tucked, watching the Vorar ship drift behind him, green lights fading like stars through fog. Holt walked up beside him, bandaged and smiling. You look tired. I'm tired of endings. Good thing we're just in the middle. The airlock hissed shut, the seal held, strut, and as Artemis turned toward the stars, Nolan whispered, more to himself than anyone, the void may not care. But we do. The dock hissed open, and Artemis returned. Black Star Station didn't celebrate. There was no anthem, no confetti, just the slow, deliberate groan of steel on steel, tired lungs exhaling after holding too much. Inside the bay, the crew walked off one by one, not limping, but waited. Like they'd brought something heavy back with them, something invisible. Holt stepped onto the deck, flinching as fluorescent lights flickered above. Still better than space, he muttered, tapping the bulkhead. Barely. Dax followed, carrying 2 helmets, his and someone else's. He didn't speak. Behind them, engineers in yellow exosuits moved like ants, sealing holes, rerouting power, scraping scorched plating from Artemis's wounded flank. Blood still marked the entry hall, some of it red, some of it green. No one cleaned it just yet. In the medbay, 2 Vorar lay quietly. Not patients. Not prisoners, just people. One held a child's sketch in her hand, lines shaky but unmistakable. A human ship and a green planet, side by side. In the mess hall where laughter used to echo, now only the clink of metal. Private Kell sat at a corner table, hands dirty with coolant. Across from him, a medic from Solus sipped tea. I used to think alien meant monster, Kell said. He wasn't angry, just tired. Today, one of them pulled my daughter from a fire corridor before she blew. The medic nodded, said nothing. Didn't need to. In the hangar, someone had scrawled across the fuel station with old carbon chalk. We returned. Someone else wrote beneath it, different. Nolan didn't go to his quarters. He walked the length of Artemis in silence, through burnt halls, past the torn EVA suits, the broken drones, the patched war panel. He didn't speak, he didn't command, he just watched. In the observation bay, the glass was cracked but functional. Stars hung outside, silent, cold, endless. He touched the window with one gloved hand, not to clean it, not to look through it, just to feel something. Behind him, Holt entered, carrying a mug. You're not going to drink this, Holt said, setting it down, but bringing it felt right. Nolan didn't turn. I don't want a medal. Wasn't going to give you one. Then what? Holt shrugged. Just thanks for answering the signal, even when no one else would. A long pause. Then Nolan asked quietly, "Would you do it again?" Holt didn't hesitate. Every damn time. From the far end of the corridor, a child's voice called out. Not human, not English, but clear, high-pitched, hopeful. One of the Vorar younglings waved from the crew's bunk hall, holding the same green ball. Nolan gave a small nod. The child mimicked him, then disappeared around the corner. Nolan finally smiled. Just a little. Just enough. He left the bay last, alone, as the lights dimmed and Black Star turned once more into silence. But this time, it was the silence after the storm, not the one before it. 3 days after Artemis docked, things on Black Star Station returned to, not normal, but something close. Supply ships resumed. Command issued no formal commendations, and most staff dismissed the Vorar incident as overblown rumor. After all, there were no official logs, no surviving visuals from the outer corridor, no confirmation that a silent-class enemy had even existed. Just fragments. Glitches. Ghosts. In the comms bay, Holt leaned back in his chair, boots on the console, sipping recycled coffee like it was a reward from the gods. The transmission light blinked red. Unusual. He tapped the console. The message wasn't Terran, not military, not Vorar standard either. Just 4 words in a child's voice, and then a soft hum. He sat up, ran the waveform through decryption, then frowned. Huh? Nolan found him 20 minutes later, staring at the same blinking screen. You look like you saw a ghost. Holt turned, deadpan. Close. Tiny green ghost. He hit playback. The words repeated. Gwar. Nolan blinked. What language is that? Vorar, barely. Kid dialect. Probably phonetic. He rewound, slowed, then said quietly, "It says, we remember the light." Nolan sat, just stared at the console. Was it for us? Holt shrugged. They sent it on the same frequency we picked up the first signal. Looping. No encryption. Just trusting we'd hear it. He paused. That's kind of their thing now, I guess. Later that night, the message echoed one last time across the observation deck. Someone had rerouted it through the ambient audio system. No announcement, no explanation, just the whisper of a child's voice. We remember the light. Over and over, like a lullaby for the void. Nolan stood there, alone. Outside, the stars burned cold and distant, but not empty. Not anymore. He took a slow breath, then reached into his jacket, pulled out the small crystal core the child had gifted, held it in both hands. The crystal pulsed faintly, one beat, then silence, then another. Behind him, Holt appeared again, holding 2 cups, recycled chamomile, romantic, figured I'd ruin the moment. Nolan nodded, but didn't smile this time. He was watching something outside. Nolan added, a pinprick of light, tiny, faint, shifting blue, not a star, not a flare, a response, from somewhere far. You think that's them? Holt asked. No, a beat. Then Nolan added, I think it's someone else, hearing what we did. Holt sipped. We're not the only ones listening anymore. No, Nolan said. We're just the first to answer. Silence again, but this time it wasn't loneliness. It was potential. It was weight. It was the universe holding its breath. Nolan spoke one last time, barely above a whisper. Words not for Holt, not for the station, but for the stars. If one day they need us again, he closed his eyes, we will still answer. They weren't meant to hear the signal, but they did. And they answered, not because they had to, but because they were human. On Sci-Fi Sky, we explore stories like this. Want more? You know where to look.